I would like to welcome everyone to today's panel discussion of New York City Labor and the new mayor, prospects for workers in a post-pandemic city. There is much to talk about. Eric Adams has been mayor for less than a month, but he has been a public figure and an elected official for decades now. Uh, but and he's been the presumptive mayor-elect since last July when he won the Democratic primary election. Yet most New Yorkers know very little about what he believes in or hopes to accomplish outside of public safety. This is especially true in relation to labor issues, which received little attention in the mayoral election and since. Today, we have the opportunity to learn from three of the city's leading journalists about the challenges working people face in New York, what we might expect from an Adams administration, and possible paths forward for the city. Eric Adams is an unusual person to become mayor of New York City at a very unusual and challenging time. Since World War II, most mayors of New York, including Bill de Blasio and Michael Bloomberg, have not grown up in the city. The few who did, like John Lindsay and Robert Wagner, mostly came from well-off backgrounds. By contrast, Eric Adams is a through and through working class New Yorker. He grew up in Queens and Brooklyn. His mother struggled to support his family, cleaning other people's homes. As Errol Lewis pointed out, Adams is the first mayor since Abe Beame to attend a public New York City high school. That takes us back a half century. And then, of course, as people mostly do know, he spent 2 decades in the New York City Police Department and as a member of a municipal union. Adrienne Adams, the new city council speaker, came from a similar background. Her mother was a corrections officer at Rikers Island. Her father was a unionized truck driver. And she and Eric Adams were actually classmates at Bayside High School, which I went to as well. I feel we should fly our flag over City Hall. So we're at a historic moment when the two top leaders of the city are both African Americans from working class families who grew up in and around and intimately know the world of civil service employment. The challenges New York City faces as Eric Adams begins his mayoralty are extraordinary. COVID-19 hit New York City harder than any place else in the country. The toll in terms of death and disease has been staggering. At the moment, thankfully, things seem to be improving, but we certainly are not out of the woods. And the future course of the pandemic is a huge unknown. Besides its public health impacts, COVID-19 has laid low the New York City economy. The current unemployment rate in New York City is 9.4%, which is twice the national average. With a state eviction moratorium now ended, a massive housing and humanitarian crisis may be upon us. And of course, the last week has tragically brought home the rising toll of gun violence and crime. To help us understand how the Adams administration may address these formidable challenges, we have a very distinguished panel of journalists. Nicole Galinas is a columnist at the New York Post, where she regularly addresses city issues. She is also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. Her analyses and opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, and other publications. She's the author of the 2011 book, After the Fall: Saving Capitalism from Wall Street and Washington. Jeffrey C. Mays is a reporter on the Metro desk of the New York Times. He covers politics with a focus on City Hall, and as I'm sure all of you know, he has written extensively about Eric Adams in recent months. Before joining the Times, he was a reporter with DNA Info and the Star Ledger. Richard Steyer has been editor of The Chief since 1998. He has spent more than 3 decades working for the paper. Prior to joining The Chief, He was a labor columnist and city hall reporter at the New York Post. He is the author of the 2014 book, Enough Blame to Go Around: The Labor Pains of New York City's Public Employee Unions. So our roundtable journalists will spend about an hour responding to questions from myself and each other, at which point I'll pose questions submitted by you members of the audience. And as Michael said, if you do have a question, please submit it through the Q&A button that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. So welcome, Nicole, welcome, Jeff, welcome, Richard. It's a pleasure to have all of you here with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Great. Let's begin. Let me begin by asking you a cluster of very broad questions, and we'll just go around and please, pick up on any or all of this that you want, and then we could kind of hone in on some more specific things. So let me begin by asking, what is Eric Adams's vision for New York City, especially as it pertains to working people? What does he want to accomplish? In a recent column, Nicole pointed out that mayors usually have the most political capital in their first year. What does Adams want to do? And how would you characterize his overall relationship with labor? And maybe we could start with Nicole and then go to Jeff and then go to Richard, and other rounds we'll mix things up. So let me hand things over to Nicole to start us.
Yeah, good afternoon, Professor Friedman, and I'm honored to be participating in the panel with my colleagues today. I think Mayor Adams's approach to labor is clearly that as he comes into office, and as we've seen unfortunately demonstrated over the past 3.5 weeks, this is an environment of crisis, multiple crises. Adams wakes up in the morning and he has a list of dozens of problems. And at the moment, public sector labor is not one of those things that he considers one of his top crises. He did not really campaign in any way on public sector labor issues. He was once again a winning candidate, not endorsed by the teachers union, considered probably incorrectly to be New York City's most powerful public sector labor union. And so I think that he will govern himself and be governed by fiscal pragmatism. If the finances of the city dictate that he needs to be tougher with labor than his predecessor, then he will do that. But if the finances of the city do not dictate that, then he will not. And for the moment, the city's finances very temporarily are doing quite well. Wall Street bonuses are up by double digits this winter. The state controller has not put out his official report, but we are likely to see a big double-digit increase in bonus-related taxes this quarter. And so the deficit that the city faces, about $3 billion projected last November, is probably once again going to take care of itself. So I think, of course, this is New York City, anything can happen, but I think if one were to predict, we will see a budget season in which Adams, again, with multiple problems, does not want this to become one of his problems.
Jeff?
Yeah, thanks for having me too. I appreciate it being here. And I think Nicole is right. I think that, during the campaign, there wasn't a lot of talk about labor. But I think politically speaking and image-wise, as you mentioned in your introduction, Mayor Adams has really tried to associate himself with labor. I can't tell you the number of times I've been out with him and he's talking to municipal employees or during the campaign, and he would say, "I'm one of you." Just saw him say it regularly. Just saw city employees really appreciate that. I even remember after he won the primary, he was participating in a parade. There was some, a bunch of members from the healthcare workers union, 1199. They did not support him, of course, in this election. They supported Maya Wiley. But the mayor was, chatting those folks up. He was, joking with them. He was like, "I forgive you, didn't support me. I'm still one of you. I'm still going to support you." So in terms of image, the type of image he wants to project as a sort of, he's called himself the blue collar mayor. It's very important. It's very powerful. because, the city employs, 330,000 people approximately. That's a huge, very influential portion of the city. As we saw during his campaign, those unions were very supportive of him. The city's largest municipal union was supportive of him. 32BJ as well. The hotel workers union was also very supportive of him, helped raise money for him as well. So I think image-wise, he definitely wants to present himself as a sort of working man, and he definitely has the background to do it, having been in a union, and his family have been in a union as well.
Okay, thanks. Richard?
Jeff is absolutely right about that in terms of Adams describing himself as a blue-collar mayor. There's something of a paradox, though. He retired from the police department as a captain, and captains are among those officers who are referred to as white shirts, because that's how you distinguish them from the police officers, the patrol cops. And he is someone who is very much a success story, someone who started out with humble beginnings, went into the police department and succeeded, advanced through the ranks, even while being a constant critic of the department and what he saw as police brutality and also as discrimination against Black officers on the force. But ultimately, he is still learning as far as labor goes. One of the positions that he did take during the course of the campaign, and he mentioned it on a couple of occasions, once notably right after District Council 37 endorsed him, was that he was going to put EMS workers at parity with other uniformed employees, and said he was going to do it in his first day on the job. Well, he's had 27 days in the job yet, and he hasn't done that. It's one of the problems of bargaining that he is going to have to deal with as he tries to navigate the difference between what he was saying on the campaign and what is possible and feasible now that he's in office.
Let me follow up, and maybe we could start with you, Richard, and then we could get to the rest of the panel. To look specifically at this issue of collective bargaining, every mayor faces it. There's a calendar that's dictated by the expiration of union contracts. This year it looks likely that the next round of contracts, the pattern will be set by DC 37 because of the sequence of contract expiration dates. That was a union that was an important endorser of Mayor Adams. But interestingly, Adams did not support its executive director, Henry Garrido, to his very large transition team. So what's going on? What might we expect in terms of the next round of bargaining? And will the fact that Eric Adams spent 2 decades as a member of a municipal union, will that color the way he approaches this, do you think?
It's hard to say at this point. It's something where currently you have Renee Campion, who had been the labor commissioner under de Blasio for the last couple of years of his administration, carrying on in that job. There's one very good practical reason for it. There's an ongoing arbitration going on with the PBA, the largest police union, and she is a prime participant in that. That is ultimately leftover business from the last round of bargaining. It's correct that DC 37 is positioned to set a new pattern. It's a question of what he's going to be able to offer to unions, that it's something that, as Nicole indicated, the city is in pretty good fiscal shape right now. It's supposed to end the current fiscal year with a surplus, and the deficits that it's facing in the next 2 fiscal years are a lot smaller than they had been projected to be even a year ago.
Okay, so I guess it still remains to be seen. Just to follow up a little bit, do you think it meant anything that Garrido was not part of the transition team?
That would be between Eric and Henry. I mean, Henry endorsed Eric, and so that it would have seemed logical, but he didn't put him there.
Right. Okay, Jeff, you want to jump in here?
I can't think of any good reason for it. If Mike Mulgrew was not part of the team, that would make sense, simply because not only had the UFT endorsed Scott Stringer, that to try and help Stringer, in early June of last year, it told its members that they should leave Eric off the ballot in addition to Andrew Yang. And the big reason for that was Adams's support of expansion of charter schools. But telling your members that so explicitly at a time when he appeared to be the front runner to capture the nomination, it was a risky political gambit. Obviously, it didn't work out.
Yeah, I mean, you know, my conversations with folks from the DC 37, the municipal union, you know, they still remain optimistic about their working relationship with the mayor. They think they have a lot of common ground. You know, one of the things that Mayor Adams has frequently said is that he feels like there's a lot of waste and mismanagement, and that taxpayers aren't getting their money's worth. A lot of politicians say that, I realize that. But, you know, my conversation with folks at DC 37, you know, they like, we agree with him on some respects. There are things that we can do better to save money so that there is, you know, more funding available for healthcare or other issues as well. So there really hasn't been any sort of fight yet between Mayor Adams and the municipal union. One thing I do know is that I don't think they will be afraid to push back. You know, during the race to become the Speaker of the City Council, which is the leader of the City Council, you know, a couple of unions got together and pushed for a candidate that the mayor didn't want. So I think, you know, when it comes time to negotiate their contracts, these unions are not going to be afraid to push back on the mayor at all.
Nicole?
Yeah, I think the new thing that we will see in bargaining this year that we haven't seen in 40 years is the specter of inflation, both in the de Blasio years, in the Bloomberg years, with the exception of the large double-digit raise that Bloomberg gave to the teachers union in his first term in return for some reforms in the teachers union contract. We've seen an environment of 2.5% raises, basically keeping up with very low annual cost inflation. And so the driver of cost in the city budget hasn't been cash raises for public sector employees. It's mainly been the cost of the healthcare and the pension benefits, which have gone up multifold since Bloomberg took office 20 years ago. So what does Adams do with the issue of inflation will be interesting to see. Back in the Koch years, the unions often tried to get automatic inflation adjustments into the contracts. In other words, if inflation was 8%, they would get an 8% raise on top of some smaller real raise. And the city always successfully resisted that. They did not want the city to get into a wage price spiral. So we've kind of gotten through all of those decades with no inflation adjustments in these labor contracts. But we've seen in the private sector over the past few months, couple large companies, their unions have successfully gotten these inflation the codicils in these contracts. And so will the labor unions push for automatic inflation adjusters in these contracts, and will the mayor push back on that? Will be interesting to see. As for DC 37 and the transition team, I don't think it means very much. I mean, the mayor the mayor-elect at the time had so many people on these transition teams. I mean, you were looking at hundreds of people. I think you may be more important if you were one of the few people left off the team for whatever reason.
Thanks. And your point about inflation is a really good one. You know, I think for a whole generation of people on both sides of the table, this is kind of an unknown. But, you know, if you go back to the Koch years, you know, there were city contracts where workers were getting 8% a year raises and their standard of living wasn't going up, you know.
Yeah.
So it's a really, it's not a new environment in the sense we did have it in the 70s and other periods in our history, but it's an unfamiliar one to most people today. And I think I'm very glad you pointed to that. One of the things that I'm curious about, and maybe it's too early to tell, is what's going to be the impact of the mayor's closeness to the uniform unions. He has in his 4 weeks in office has displayed unusual closeness to a couple of the unions, particularly COBA, the Correctional Officers Union, and the PBA, the Policemen's Union that he himself had been a member of. He's invited their leaders to stand beside him at press conferences. He's adopted some of their proposals. There's always a bit of a tension between the uniform unions and the non-uniforms, and they sometimes bargain in separate coalitions. Do you think this is going to be a problem within the labor movement? Is this going to be a source of potential tension? Any insight into that, anyone?
I would say that mayors may pick alliances with unions, but it's rare that they are able to give most favored nation treatment to a single union. It's problematic because of long-time links in terms of bargaining that usually you keep stability by giving everybody the same raise, by finding a pattern and then using it. And usually there'll be a marginally better contract for uniform workers as opposed to civilian workers. And the argument is because they're putting their lives on the line. But it's not likely to really take that form. That in terms of what's been happening with COBA, Adams has been talking about working conditions and talking about what they have had to endure, while also mentioning what prisoners have had to endure. That in some of the media, there was this sense that the officers were either goofing off and taking advantage of unlimited sick leave, or that they were just being brutal to inmates. I can't speak to the question of whether there were, in fact, some correction officers abusing unlimited sick leave, but even that I would look at as partly a product of the fact that you had had this disinvestment in Rikers Island, and there was suspicion on the part of the unions that de Blasio was doing it to help pave the way for shutting down Rikers. If it's a dysfunctional place that has to be done away with, then people aren't going to look as hard at whether his plan really made sense or whether he got stampeded into it by the council speaker at the time at a point when he was running for re-election.
I think there is some concern, particularly when you talk to advocates about the mayor's closeness with the Correction Officers Association, for example. The mayor supported a return to using solitary confinement, which the discussion has been changing how that is used in city jails. A group of council members put out a letter really criticizing the mayor over that. And so there's a concern that that sort of closeness, that support could lead to policies that people feel like the city has been trying to examine in a closer way or move away from. You talked about the PBA. Another example is, we've had this unfortunate, the shooting deaths of the two police officers in Harlem. And in response, the mayor has, put out changes to public safety that he'd like to enact, including, bringing back certain police squads that are sort of plainclothes or semi-plainclothes. Again, there's been a concern about the history of what happens when you have those sort of police squads out there. So I think the concern that I've heard from a lot of advocates is that sort of his closeness to some of the unions may lead to policies that some people feel are not beneficial for certain portions of the city, specifically minority people who have had a history of negative interactions with police. And of course, certainly most of the jail population consists of people of color as well.
The point that I would make in response is that the officers within the city jail system are 85% minority. I think it's roughly 70 or 75% Black. And so that you're dealing with a situation in which both the jailed and the jailers come from the same backgrounds, often come from the same neighborhoods. And I think that the argument that Adams would make is that it's not out of coziness with the union. Certainly he's not cozy with the PBA, but that it reflects his own belief in how you keep order within the systems. That in terms of on the streets, it was something where he was campaigning and was arguing that you need safety first and foremost if you're going to have a prosperous, functioning city. And you have the kind of mayhem that's going on. I mean, in terms of the anti-crime unit, it was disbanded basically a few days after the George Floyd protests began. And it was something where it was largely a political move. There had been a couple of egregious cases in which there seemed to be abuse of authority, excessive force by members of the anti-crime units. But when people talk about shootings, very often they're talking about shootings that took place in the late 1990s with the forerunner of the anti-crime units, the street crime unit. And I think that Adams feels that it could be that disbanding the anti-crime units, which had one of their prime functions being to get guns off the street, it swung the pendulum too far. That one reason for the rise in shootings was that you did not have people who were going out with a specific mission to try and apprehend people and take the guns off the street, that you have to find a balance between the excessive use of stop and frisk that was a hallmark of the Bloomberg years and something where you actually have people doing the job that led to the abuses that were ordered in the form of a quota system, as opposed to simple police smarts in terms of figuring out who it is that may be carrying, as opposed to let me fill my quota and stop some random people of color because that way I get the numbers in, which was horrible policing. It was stupid policing.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here, but if I would just make a technical point about the corrections officers, as Richard said, there has been much made of the fact that the corrections officers have unlimited sick time, and they have certainly been taking advantage of that unlimited sick time over the past 2 years. But who gave them the unlimited sick time? This was something that the city government gave as a benefit as part of the collective bargaining process. And so in order to get that back, the city is going to have to give something in collective bargaining in return. If this is an important enough issue for the city government, they are going to have to buy that back somehow in the contract negotiation process. And I think this points up that the city really locks itself into a lot of unnecessary inflexibility with only focusing on pattern bargaining and never stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. Do we want to encourage the people in the corrections union to come to this job with a different mindset and a different set of skills, which either existing officers could be trained for, or you would attract new people who have those skills, so that it is not this constant the jailer versus the jail dynamic that has gone on there for decades and decades. One of the constructive things to come out of the de Blasio administration's tours of the European jail and prison systems was people from very different backgrounds taking these corrections jobs. And do you change this sort of poisonous environment by having a kind of shakeup like that here? But very hard to do that through the collective bargaining process, where you're in this envelope where you can give a certain raise, you can buy back that sick time, which will completely destroy your flexibility to do anything else. So all you've got is a contract with tiny little bit of change within that envelope, but no real change in the culture, in the discipline, or what corrections officers want to accomplish in this job.
Yeah, let me follow that up, because I think this issue is really important one, and the Rikers case, although it's very particular, sort of touches on broader issues. I'm thinking of a couple of things here. One is the issue that we've been talking about discipline, which of course was a huge issue during the Bloomberg administration in relationship to the schools. So it's not just corrections officers, where what should be the role of unionism, what's the mayor's powers, what should they be? And then, at Rikers, a secondary factor has been vaccine mandates, and nationally, all across the country, this has been a tremendous flashpoint. Does the government have the right to require its own employees, to have vaccines, to wear masks, whatever it might be? Is that right? How's that going to be handled? And of course, it's not just been public health considerations. I mean, for example, the MTA has not required things that other public agencies have, and they're pretty frank. They say, workers won't show up and we won't be able to run the system. Well, I mean, is that a legitimate criterion to use here? So, any thoughts about how Adams might approach this issue of these interrelated issues of how much can the mayor change, or impose, or should impose disciplinary procedures, public health standards, and so forth?
In terms of the public health standards, de Blasio was relying on the 1905 Supreme Court decision that found that in a time of a health crisis, that public safety, public health outweighs individual freedoms. His argument would be that the only reason that the vaccination numbers went up, particularly among uniformed employees, was because they were facing suspensions and possible firings. That left to their own devices, you would have seen less than half of their members getting the vaccine, which was the case at the time that he put the first mandate into effect, which was for teachers and healthcare workers, and later expanded it to uniformed employees.
I mean, I think with the unions, what they really want to see is any sort of changes to work conditions be subject to bargaining. The pandemic is not over yet, so what happens if the FDA changes their guidelines and requires more boosters to be considered, fully vaccinated, for example? In my conversations with union leaders, what they want is for to be able to go to the table with that, and for that to be something that's subject to negotiation. When Mayor Adams was mayor-elect and Mayor de Blasio was dealing with this issue, what he said was that he would, in effect, try to do that he would try to sit down and work with unions on some of these issues and come to the table with them. So I'm sure he's going to have his chance to do that before long.
Yeah, as the acute emergency recedes, which means it may still feel like an emergency at many times, but this is clearly not something that has come out of the blue like it did 2 years ago, and we have to grapple with ways of dealing with it that we didn't have to grapple with before. I agree with both Jeff and Richard. This is going to be a bargaining issue if you've got to comply with unknown regimes of vaccines in the future. That is going to be something that the unions will want to be compensated for. Even something like wearing a mask. A couple of years ago, when people said, why are these uniform employees not wearing the mask? Well, it's not part of the uniform standard. If you were to actually take it through the disciplinary process, you might find an outcome that the management side of city government does not want, which is why I think they never really pushed it through that process very far. It was always a mandate, but with pretty voluntary compliance of that mandate. So a very gray area. In Professor Freeman, you brought up the MTA. I know you're a close observer of the transit system, and I think that's also a place where what kind of raises that the transport workers union gets interplay with what kind of raises that city workers get. The MTA contract up next year, not this year, a very interesting scenario where obviously ridership is way down, revenues are way down, that federal aid is going to run out. No indication that the MTA will get another package of federal aid as we go past the midterm elections and go into the presidential election. And then of course the transit workers are going to also be thinking about inflation. So do we get into a situation where the transport workers union asks for an increase in pay commensurate with inflation, and then you turn around and you say, well, we can't raise the fares commensurate with 2 or 3 years worth of inflation? That would be a 20% fare hike on people using the transit system, who right now tend to be the lower paid workers. So does this become something where it breaks with the pattern of the city because of these unique circumstances? Or they either benefit from the pattern that Adams sets, or conversely, these contracts run into next year and the city workforce waits and see to see what happens with the MTA. So, and of course, that also depends on the gubernatorial election, what transpires there. So much beyond just what Adams, what his personal background is and what he's thinking going forward. Some of this is also outside of his control.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point. And of course, it is mostly out of the mayor's control, but it does have spillover effects. And, I remember in 1980, when the Transport Workers Union went on strike, the strongest opponent of the strike was Mayor Koch, who famously sort of egged on, commuters walking over the Brooklyn Bridge. And I think one of his main considerations was, would this set a pattern that he would then have to meet with city workers? I have one final little question about collective bargaining. There are a lot of other things to talk about, but I know some of our listeners are interested in this. This seems like a small issue, but it actually affects hundreds of thousands of people, which is the city's plan to move its retirees from traditional Medicare to this Medicare Advantage plan. It was something that the unions and the city negotiated, but it's turned out there's been a lot of opposition from retirees. There's a court case, it's stalled. It's become a big public issue. And interestingly, during the campaign, Adams said, hey, wait, that's my retiree plan, And he said, I don't know, maybe this is bait and switch. Maybe we should undo this. And then he kind of walked it back. And now there's no public comments. Anyone have any insight if he is going to do anything about this and where he may land on it?
I don't know whether he's going to do something, but I think that somebody told him that bait and switch was a glib oversimplification, that basically what you've got here is a situation in which the city and the unions wanted to make a change to produce savings, that from the union standpoint, every extra dollar that they've got to spend on rising health benefit costs is a dollar that they can't bring back to their members in the form of pay raises. And so that they were willing to do something. The argument that they've made on both sides, and I think that there's something to it, is that the deal that they were able to make is not like other Medicare Advantage plans, that they've tailored it in such a way that benefits are going to be equal to, and in some cases actually better than what existed under the current city plan. That at this point, it's not on hold. It's simply not going to take effect until April 1st. And at that point, by that point, people will have to have decided whether they want to go in or whether they want to stick with their old health plan. And one of the arguments that they've made is people are complaining about copays, but there were going to be copays under the existing plan as well, simply because costs continue to be prohibitive.
Yeah, I think this is also, and I agree with everything Richard said, but this is also a place where taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture can be useful. So the city has promised $100 billion with a B dollars worth of future healthcare retirement benefits to current retirees and future retirees, and set very little money aside to pay for those future benefits. So the pensions, at least the pensions, are substantially funded. In other words, for some of our students who are watching, the city promises pension benefits. And at the time it makes that promise, it sets aside most of that money to invest and to pay those future pension benefits. With the healthcare benefits, by contrast, it is almost entirely pay as you go. In other words, someone works today, he or she earns those healthcare benefits in retirement today, but the city waits 30 years until those retirement benefits come due. Then it goes and scrounges and finds the money to make that payment. So from a city worker's perspective, I am being promised something, but there is no money aside to fund that promise. And unlike the pension benefits, This is not protected by the state constitution. This is simply an issue of bargaining. The people who are bargaining on your behalf are not actually bargaining on your behalf, because they're more bargaining from the perspective of the current workforce, not the retiree workforce. So unless and until the city starts to be serious about setting money aside for these benefits as they are accrued, these benefits are always at risk, and that risk will grow as the city runs into longer term budget problems. I'm sitting here in Midtown Manhattan. Unless Midtown Manhattan recovers to what it looked like 2.5 years ago, the long-term tax base of the city is substantially different than it was in 2019. And so, the narrow issues of what does this plan look like? Can I still get my treatment at certain hospitals, which is certainly critical to someone who is retired now, to someone experiencing health issues right now. And these issues need to be addressed, but the longer term issues need to be addressed as well.
Jeff, you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mayor Adams has said he's going to examine the issue. He has, I guess, until April when the changes will push back to, my conversation with some union folks, they raised this as a sort of the retirees bringing this up as a sort of major issue. People think it's going to go through. Still unclear if the mayor is going to make any changes. I mean, there's been so much going on right now, especially with his focus on crime and some of the incidents. So there really hasn't been a lot of focus on this. So, I think it might be surprising if there is a big change to this, given the fact that it's really been obscured by the other issues that the mayor has been facing at the moment. But I do know the concern is real. I've heard from a few retirees concerned about their benefits, whether they'd be able to see the same practitioners, any sort of additional payments that they would have to make monthly payments. And we know healthcare is often one of the biggest issues. So I think we're going to have to wait over the next couple of months to see if the mayor chooses to make any sort of changes.
Thanks. Well, let's move on to the budget. A couple of you have already mentioned, the potential problems that we have come through the pandemic surprisingly well as a city financially, but nonetheless, the city right now has the largest workforce in its history. It has a high unemployment rate. It has a very uncertain future. So, it's very unclear where things will be, a year or 2 or 3 years from now. How do you think the mayor will approach the budget crunch? I mean, he has already done something a lot of mayors do. He's asked the departments to come up with potential cuts. But that's so far, just a kind of paper exercise. Can New York sustain a workforce of its size? And will the mayor's relations with municipal unions color his approach to budgetary issues and workforce size? Jeff, maybe we could start with you on this one.
Sure, I think we're. As we mentioned earlier, we're in this sort of, difficult financial period. We are unsure of how the city is going to rebound. Things are okay right now, as Nicole mentioned earlier, but that could change. The federal money that's keeping the budget afloat right now is not guaranteed beyond a couple of years. And then we could face some very serious issues. Who knows what's going to happen with Wall Street, with real estate. People are working from home, they want hybrid work. How will that affect the value of the city's real estate, where a huge portion of our taxes come from? So I think those are issues that are sort of facing the city that the mayor is going to have to really walk a really careful line. He's tried to place himself as a sort of technocrat, someone who wants to use technology to improve efficiency. As I said earlier, he's mentioned multiple times that, taxpayers just aren't getting their money's worth, that, there are efficiencies that can be squeezed out of the budget. And so, when he introduces his budget, it'll be interesting to see, what some of those efficiencies are. Certainly with a $100 billion budget, it's going to be really difficult to squeeze massive savings out in that way. But, with the plans he's introduced so far, for example, policing, he's called for police to patrol the subways more in their sector, for example, when there's not an emergency call. There's no discussion about adding new police. What he's talked about is just adding new work details for these officers, so as to sort of stretch their use. He's questioned, police officers standing around, for example. There are too many police officers at parades. Why are there 8 police officers standing here when I show up somewhere? They should be out doing this work. But certainly that's not going to be enough to necessarily get the sort of savings that he might need. So I think we still have to wait a bit to see his introductory budget, but certainly there are some big problems looming in the future.
Mayors always have to be conscious of budget circumstances. The most labor-friendly mayor prior to Dinkins, prior to Adams, who was elected, was David Dinkins. And basically within a couple of years of taking office, he was forced to lay off a couple of thousand people, most of them from District Council 37, which astonished people, partly because Dinkins was emotionally invested in those people. DC 37 had been one of his prime endorsers, but he was simply up against it and decided that he had no choice to do that. It wound up influencing DC 37's decision to accept a contract that began with a 2-year wage freeze when Rudy Giuliani took office, and facing a similar budget crunch, told DC 37 that unless it agreed to those terms, that he could let go of tens of thousands of employees. I don't think that Stanley Hill, who was the head of DC 37 at the time, thought that it would be that many. But if you were looking at Dinkins had been forced to lay off a couple of thousand, Rudy, who had no emotional investment in those employees and could be argued was indifferent to many of them, why wouldn't he go ahead with 8,000 layoffs if you didn't come across? And so that it becomes something where some mayors can use it as a weapon, and some mayors are simply forced to do things that they would prefer not to, simply because times are so tight.
Yeah, I think paradoxically, the time for the mayor to really take a careful chisel to the budget would be now, so that he can avoid having to take an axe to the budget 2 or 3 years from now. So he should optimally use these, it's hard to call them good times, but from the perspective of the city budget, this is probably as good as it's going to get for the mayor. And so not just doing the pegs, but just, looking at the Department of Education, for example, de Blasio added tens of thousands of back office administrative workers to the Department of Education. Now, you don't want to see mass scale layoffs, but what can be accomplished through attrition to not hiring for vacant positions? Do all of that now, and then you avoid the mass scale layoffs a couple of years from now. But I do think, again, the broader picture, this is a real inflection point for the city's economy. If you go back really to the Wagner days, the city made many mistakes, which we could talk for hours about, from Wagner to Lindsay to Beam, but it did get one thing right, which was that the future of the city would not be millions of blue-collar factory jobs. The city was not going to work as a place for horizontal factories where people drove to their factory job and parked in the parking lot. There were many things that we did to accelerate that process, but in the end, that was going to happen anyway. The city's future would be white-collar office jobs. And starting with Mayor Wagner, the city had a specific policy of building up the Midtown office districts with new modern skyscrapers, 6th Avenue corridor, Park Avenue corridor. And this worked. The future of the city was indeed white collar work, and also the immigrant and service work that served all of these new white collar jobs. We started to turn around our population decline in the early 1980s because baby boomers were coming to the city to work in finance, work in advertising, work in fashion. Everybody had to commute to their jobs in Midtown and Lower Manhattan. And as Professor Friedman brought up the 1980 transit strike, the striking thing about the 1980 transit strike was that people did not say, you know what, I'll just take this week off from work. I'll just work at home. I'll read a book. They did everything that they possibly could to come into work. They rode bicycles, they put on their sneakers and walked for miles. They took the PATH train to New Jersey, then took it back to Manhattan. No question of missing even a day of work. And now people have missed 2 years of working in Midtown Manhattan. They have proven, and their employers have proven, that they do not need to be in Midtown Manhattan after a certain threshold of financial and other costs. And so the balance of power is different in a way that it has never been different. And that has a lot of implications for the tax base that the city hasn't even started to think about yet.
Let me pick up on that, because I think it raises a broader point. I don't know if how many people saw an interesting column that Paul Krugman wrote about a week or so ago, who pointed out that, New York City has become extremely dependent on the finance industry, and obviously so. And that, he said there are many good things about that, but as Nicole was just talking about, under the conditions of the pandemic, of course, that's all changed, because so many of the workers in that sector don't go into the city. And then all the ripple effects, in retail and service and restaurants and hotels disappear. And here we are with almost a double-digit unemployment rate. Moving forward, hopefully coming out of a pandemic, what kind of economic development program should the city be pursuing? Is this something Adams has thought much about? And I think this is linked to another issue, the issue of economic inequality. On paper, New York City has unbelievably high economic inequality, partially because we have these super rich people, but we have a lot of poverty too. And a lot of New Yorkers like to feel very superior to the rest of the world. But if you compare us to places like Houston or other Sunbelt cities, our level of inequality is much higher. The previous mayor made this a centerpiece. Maybe he did some good things, but he didn't substantially change this. So this is a long build up to the question of how does Adams think about these issues? Is inequality an issue for him? Does he have a kind of economic development strategy? Who are the players that he goes to when he's going to be having to make decisions about this? This is not really something that's come up much publicly so far. Anyone want to take a stab?
I'll take a stab if
Please.
you like. I think it's also striking that the mayor hasn't talked very much about inequality. Certainly nothing compared to de Blasio, who ran and won on the Tale of Two Cities. And I think that's due to a couple factors. I mean, no one is disputing that the economy before 2020 was highly imperfect, but it will be a lot more imperfect unless we get back to something resembling 2019 or replace it with something that provides as many jobs. And if you think about the jobs that are missing here in Midtown Manhattan, we are still missing tens of thousands of our retail jobs, tens of thousands of our restaurant jobs, tens of thousands of our office support jobs. These jobs were held by people who commute from the Bronx, commute from Eastern Queens, commute from Central Brooklyn. So unless we figure out how to rebuild the tourist economy, rebuild Manhattan's retail economy, and get people back to the office even 2 or 3 days a week, these temporary job losses become permanent job losses. So what you see is that people who used to work have no choice but to move away from the city if they want to find those job opportunities again. And so I think this part of it really fits well into Adams's public safety platform. We will not get people to come back to the offices in Midtown unless they feel safe on the subway. We had a professional woman, Michelle Go, violently pushed to her death on the subway tracks 2 weeks ago. That is, of course, a great tragedy in and of itself. But many, many professional women around the tri-state region look at this and say, that could have been me on the subway platform at 9:40 in the morning in Times Square. If you cannot keep people safe in the middle of the day at the busiest subway station in the city, then where can you keep people safe? So until we settle the public safety issue, and also even when it is not acute violent crime, but having to step over needles around Penn Station to get to work, being heckled and harassed as you walk to work, not wanting to walk in Midtown Manhattan after dark. I have lived in the city for 23 years, never once worried about walking in Midtown after dark. And now this is a new logistical concern. If I am at the office after 5 o'clock, do I feel safe walking home? So until the mayor figures out these issues, very, very difficult to have an economic development program.
I think
I think the mayor Mayor Adams hasn't talked about inequality in the sort of necessarily the explicit way that Bill de Blasio talked about it, as a sort of ideological approach that he took to inequality. What the mayor has said is that there are, and this is why I think he was able to win election, is that there are huge portions of the city, a lot of Black and brown people, that have not been able to take advantage of the wealth, the opportunities that the city has to offer. And he wants to change that. And I think Nicole is exactly right. The focus has been so much on crime. One of Mayor Adams' constant terms is that public safety is the prerequisite to prosperity. So much of the campaign was spent talking about crime and dealing with crime, when initially a lot of people thought the mayoral campaign was really going to be about how does the city recover economically from the pandemic. And because we started seeing some high-profile incidents, the focus really shifted to crime. So I think the mayor has some work to do to talk about how he's actually going to bring those people who've been excluded from the city's economy into the economy. I know broadly he feels like things such as the educational system being unequal are part of the problem, and that he wants to fix how the educational system works so that people who grow up here in the city can be able to take advantage of the jobs and opportunities that are available here. So he really speaks about inequality in a sort of more broad way. And then economically speaking, I know we've heard that the mayor took some of his first paychecks in cryptocurrency, or he changed it into cryptocurrency. A lot of people in the crypto industry that I spoke to really saw that as an opportunity for him to attract a new industry here. Crypto is really decentralized. They could do that work from anywhere. But after the mayor announced that he was going to convert his first paycheck, one crypto company announced that they were going to hire 100 more people to work here in the city. So I think there's that sort of track of increasing opportunity for people to deal with inequality, also bringing in sort of new industries like crypto, and in a way that Mayor de Blasio never did. Mayor Adams has said the city needs to lean on its corporate community. He talked about, for his public safety plan, he talked about providing young people with more summer jobs. What he wants to do is go directly to the private industry and have them help set that program up. When you talk to a lot of people in the business community, they felt Mayor de Blasio did not often lean on them enough or seek their expertise and help in dealing with these issues. But Mayor Adams seems like he's going to be a different type of mayor in respect to that.
The points that Jeff and Nicole made are both very much on the mark, that You need this sense of safety in order to get people to start commuting again, that there are advantages to being in the office rather than working at home. But if people are worried about crime and crime caused because there are mentally ill people who are wandering through the subway system or on the streets, then they are going to decide that it's better to lose something and work from home than to put myself at risk that way. Very early, the mayor was chiding Wall Street firms for not having people come back to the office because of the fact that so much of the city's economy depends upon lots of foot traffic in Manhattan, people having meals there, people buying in these stores there. But again, once you get a greater sense of safety than currently exists, that's going to be the climate in which people can comfortably return to work, and you can see that economic engine start percolating again. In terms of the education part, I think that he thinks that that's a very important part of economic development in the city in dealing with inequality. And one of the problems and one of the great flaws of the de Blasio administration was that in terms of his first chancellor was someone who was largely a caretaker. His second chancellor was an ideologue. And while he was fighting these battles over elite high schools, that they weren't getting close to fixing the big problem that keeps more Black and brown kids from being able to get into those high schools. And that's the poor quality of the middle schools in so many of the poorer neighborhoods of the city. It was one of these things that was problematic in terms of Mike Mulgrew's critique of Adams for favoring charter school expansion. How do you put up with the quality of the schools in those neighborhoods and say that we're not going to use charter schools, or someone who looks to expand charter schools is antithetical to what this union is supposed to be about? That what are you giving them as an alternative?
Yeah,
there's so much. Oh, I'm sorry, Nicole.
I was just going to say quickly, as my colleague Ray Dominico says, traditional public school enrollment has declined precipitously throughout this pandemic. Not just people keeping their kids home from school because they were fearful, but disenrollment altogether, where the charter school enrollments has held up. And so people are sending some kind of message to the city government that the city has to pay attention to.
There's so much here. Let me ask a couple follow-ups, some of which are from myself, but we're also now getting a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to weave some of those in. And I want to follow up on both this issue of tech and this issue of education. So let me get to tech first, and then we'll get back to education in a second. This has come up a bunch of times, and Jeff, you particularly stressed the way Adams thinks of himself. The Bitcoin has gotten a lot of publicity. But two follow-ups on this. One is, what does this actually mean for a lot of city workers, particularly lower paid city workers? In the most technically advanced implementations of new systems in blue collar industries, for example, the Uber type of systems for rides as opposed to traditional taxis, or in all these food service delivery systems, the standard of living, the conditions of employment for workers have actually gone down, not up, as tech has been employed. And I guess one question is, what can the mayor do? Does he think at all about doing to actually make sure that the benefits of tech get distributed to those workers who are literally on the front line of that? The second follow-up comes from one of the audience members who asked about crypto and said, well, wait a second, what does crypto say about climate policy? After all, crypto mining is a tremendous user of energy, and a lot of it's kind of dirty energy. Is the mayor, maybe unintentionally, sending a signal about, climate policy in his embrace of crypto for himself and for the city? So two of those follow-ups, and anyone who wants to jump in, please do.
I think, Eric, what makes Mayor Adams so fascinating is the fact that he is able to sort of identify as a sort of blue collar person because of his background. But, again, the fact that he sees himself as a bit of a techie, when he was Brooklyn Borough president, he supported Airbnb, which a lot of his fellow politicians at the time, including, Tish James and Jumaane Williams, were raising a lot of issues about how Airbnb affected affordable housing in the city, whether it was diminishing the availability of affordable housing. Now you have the mayor, talking about crypto and wanting to make them a central industry here in the city. And he's often talked about how he wants to attract those sort of new tech businesses to the city. So he's been able to sort of talk to both sides as I'm a blue collar, but I'm also in favor of business. What I think has been missing and what he hasn't had the power to do up until now is to be able to connect those two individuals, those two entities, to be able to find a way to help business provide jobs for people in the city. And of course, we know that is dependent on people getting the necessary skills. So one of the things that we didn't hear a lot during the campaign is about workforce development. That is going to be a huge issue if Mayor Adams is going to actually connect working class people in the city to any new industries that come here. So he has work to do in terms of releasing a clear plan on how to deal with workforce development. Mayor de Blasio, as we know, promised 100,000 jobs paying $50,000 or more, did not deliver on that. The concern from the workforce development industry was there's just not simply investment in helping to train these individuals. And also the investment was not focused in the city's sort of poorest communities. So now that Mayor Adams has this power as mayor, he's going to have to actually do more than just be a booster for Airbnb or be a booster for crypto. If you're a booster for crypto and they come to the city, you're going to have to show how they are providing jobs that are helping the poorest, most troubled New Yorkers.
Yeah, I'm a little bit worried about the lack of skepticism of tech. I mean, what Mayor Adams is doing is taking his paycheck and then investing that money in a highly speculative investment that can lose value, and it can lose all of its value. Now, I am not saying that it is going to lose all of its value. Crypto could gain in value, lose a little, gain a little, but it is not a currency. This is a speculative asset investment. Now, of course, the mayor is free to invest his money in whatever he chooses to invest his money in. If he wants to put it in GameStop stock, that would be fine as well. But when it goes beyond his personal speculative choices, for example, do we want food delivery apps to essentially take over the bicycle lanes of the city with an economic model that puts people out there and forces them to buy a non-pedal motorized bicycle because they cannot drive the many, many miles that they need to drive every day on a traditional bicycle, puts these people in danger because they are under tremendous pressure to make these deliveries while the food is still hot. And then, of course, have a setup where there is no workman's compensation insurance. Many of these e-cyclists have been killed. I think the Times said last October, it's been 17 e-cyclists killed delivering food. The families do not get any kind of compensation. These are considered independent contractors. And so ironically, the real tale of two cities, when de Blasio was talking about the new $15 minimum wage, for legal W-2 wage workers in the city, we have a whole separate city of people who are making below minimum wage, people who are undocumented immigrants, so they can't complain very much about their working conditions. Is this being done under the guise of tech, where we cannot question what Uber Eats and what Grubhub and what Relay are doing because they're tech? They're not really tech. They are a sort of tech glomming on to serious issues that go back hundreds of years of workplace conditions.
Richard, do you want to join in on this one?
I would just be inclined to be suspicious of something like cryptocurrency, that there have been people who have talked about it as potentially a Ponzi scheme simply because so little is known and understood about it, that, you know, it's a little bit as if you had somebody saying, hey, there's a lot of money that can be made by gambling. I've figured out a system and other people should consider it. I mean, it's just something where I think it's a little bit iffy. It may be an indulgence on his part. It may be something that interests him, but until we know more, I wouldn't be leaping into that world based on the fact that the mayor seems to think that it's stimulating.
This is a question that came up from the audience, but it fits very nicely into this discussion, which is the issue of the City University of New York. You know, CUNY is a kind of hybrid institution. The dominant financier is the state, and they have the most say on the Board of Trustees. But, you know, the community colleges, the two-year schools, are primarily funded by New York City, and the mayor does have representatives on the Board of Trustees. And, you know, several recent mayors have talked about wanting to take back CUNY, including, and they've also talked about wanting to take back the MTA. You know, CUNY has been shown to be a great ladder of upward mobility, a place where there is a lot of workforce development. Any sense of what we might expect from the mayor about the City University in terms of its budget and a more public role for the mayor in governing this historical institution? I take it this is not an issue that's come up much yet with the new mayor. Maybe the silence is the answer to that question. I'm not sure.
Maybe you should take a crack at it.
Well, I don't know. You know, it's just interesting. You know, I mean, quite quietly, actually, Bill de Blasio did increase city funding for the community colleges, but I think, like the MTA, it's a mixed blessing to be in charge of something like CUNY. You know, and but certainly, look, I'm a partisan, but you know, it seems to me that it is a great avenue for development for our city population, you know, both in terms of workforce preparation and beyond that, you know, is creating, you know, engaged citizenry. So, you know, I'd love to see the mayor engage with it more, you know, and a huge number of city council members and city officials are CUNY graduates. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see, but I'll move on. Here's a question, never would occur to me, but someone raised it, and I'm just going to read it. How do you see the cannabis industry unfolding in New York under the new mayor, as the MRTA legislation has LBA, I don't even know what that means, and calls for social equality in licensing as well as automatic expunging of records? And I know upstate, this is considered an economic development issue, you know, in many of the towns. Any sense of the Adams administration on this one?
I'll jump in, and maybe someone will disagree with me for a little spice in the discussion. But there's a big difference between decriminalizing people carrying small amounts of marijuana and legalizing and encouraging the smoking of marijuana. We still don't know what are the short-term or the long-term effects of the developing brain of smoking marijuana. And as for this being an economic development industry, just like crypto or some of the tech factions, I think a degree of skepticism is warranted here. You know, we don't, New York State has a farming industry. There are a few people who make tremendous amounts of money farming. Most people manage to eke out a living on their farm. This is a labor of love. This is no different than any type of farming distribution and then retail operation. If you can make a living in traditional farming distribution and retail operation, you can probably probably make a living somewhere in the cannabis industry. If you have been unable to do so, this is not some sort of panacea for people who were unable to engage in the legal workforce. So again, no one is saying that anyone should go to jail or let alone prison for carrying or smoking a small amount of marijuana. But to hang your hat on this as some sort of massive job creating business, I think we should really look at this with some skepticism.
Yeah, that would be my biggest concern is monitoring whether there actually is any social equity gain from minority business owners participating in this industry. I mean, right now, you look at the companies that have the medical marijuana licenses. I mean, they effectively have a head start on getting into this industry. Bigger corporations, how are smaller businesses going to compete to get the capital to deal with the licensing? We're seeing some places across the state where municipalities are opting out of having legal marijuana sold there. So I think it's going to really be up to the state legislature to ensure in any sort of way whether any of the promises made around social equity are kept. I know a lot of people that I speak to are not optimistic at this point.
You have an issue in terms of the feeling that the marijuana that's being produced today is stronger and potentially more addictive than the marijuana that was smoked by some of us 30 or 40 years ago. And therefore, there ought to be greater care exercised as government looks to regulate it. In terms of the moral aspects of it, I mean, the same moral aspects come into play when you're talking about legalized sports gambling. And it's something that we can decry that states and cities become so dependent upon this type of economic development from industries that are perhaps inducing people to do things that once indulged into too great an extent are not good for them. But it's a reality, and we're not going to be able to change that, I don't think.
And Jeff mentioned the equity issue, which I think is important. And I think this is another place where we have very superficial conclusions, not based on a lot of evidence. For example, that the children of rich people just smoke marijuana with no intervention, whereas the children of poor people were put into the criminal justice system. Of course, there's a great element of truth in that, but you go beyond that. And the children of rich people, if their parents catch them smoking marijuana, they pack them off to rehab for a month immediately. And these children are highly supervised, highly controlled during every aspect of their life. If you look at the towns that are opting out of marijuana, these are the richer towns. These are not the poorer towns. So we're going to create another inequity where we make it easier for teenagers in poor neighborhoods to engage in this activity, whereas the parents of the richer children are still going to be monitoring and supervising their children and keeping them away from this behavior as much as possible. Now, I know that somehow, despite this, the children of richer people still manage to smoke marijuana, but there is a much greater degree of this is not something that you should be doing. This is not acceptable behavior in people who are going to private school, people who are, on this track to upward mobility. And so we don't want the government to be saying to the children of poorer people, yeah, you should be smoking marijuana, which is effectively the direction that we're going in.
Great. Well, we have time for just one or two more. Here's a question. I'm just going to read it. What is the early assessment of the mayor's top appointees? Do they reveal anything about Adams's plans for the city? There seems to be very little articulation of the mayor's philosophy on broad issues, except for policing.
There are a number of positions where he is, at least for the moment, simply retained people. The health commissioner would be one example. The fire commissioner announced the other day that he's going to be retiring, but they don't have anyone lined up to replace him yet. And it's not clear as to whether he's going to simply hire from within the department, as has often been the case. In terms of schools chancellor, David Banks looks like a solid pick. He's someone who's got an educational background, which is something where, in terms of, you look back to Bloomberg, and one of the reasons that Bloomberg did not get lasting results was he started out with a lawyer and then he went to a magazine executive. And it was only after she had washed out that you actually put in someone who was an educator and had that type of background. So to me, that's a positive. In terms of his police commissioner, she is a very strong presence. I've heard that she shows up very well in terms of meetings with groups of police officers. You saw it at Harlem Hospital, in which she gave that impassioned speech following the death of Officer Rivera, that she is striking in that, but the lack of big time experience that she's had in running a large police department raises some questions in people's minds as to whether he is, much like Rudy Giuliani, going to try and function as his own police commissioner. That's something that still has to be determined. In terms of some of the other jobs, it remains to be seen. You've got to look at an administration over at least 6 months and possibly a year before you can make a fair assessment of that. I mean, one of the best examples was the fact that Ed Koch started out with 7 deputy mayors, and by the end of his first year, not only had he gotten rid of all 7 of them, he replaced them with 3, and 3 was pretty much the magic number for the 12 years that he was in office.
Yeah, and of course, very unusually, Eric Adams has appointed 5 female deputy mayors. It was quite a statement, and you know, many of them were kind of permanent government types, quite experienced people. But as you say, Richard, remains to be seen. Jeff and Nicole, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things you can glean from the mayor's early appointments is that he certainly values loyalty, and that he has a very tight circle. You know, David Banks, who I think many people agree is the star, choice for chancellor. I've heard many positive things about him. His brother, Phil Banks, was appointed as deputy mayor for public safety. You could argue those are 2 of the most important positions for what Mayor Adams has argued he wants to do for the city, which is to try to return a sense of public safety and also improve educational opportunities, especially for the poorest New Yorkers. Sheena Wright, who is the deputy mayor for strategic operations, is David Banks' partner. So, you have people around him that he really trusts. Idanis Rodriguez, the transportation commissioner, was one of his biggest supporters throughout the course of the campaign. So it's going to be interesting to see whether that's a good or bad thing, whether the mayor will be willing to take advice from people who he trusts more, or, are these people going to be able to challenge him in the ways that the mayor sometimes needs to be challenged in terms of making very important policy and strategic decisions.
Yeah, with regards to Philip Banks, I think this is one of these things where if Adams delivers on his promises, if by the end of the year we've got a significant decrease in the murder rate, and we have a police department that is engaging respectfully with the public, then people will not focus on Phil Banks. But if Adams does not succeed, then this is going to be a bigger issue with Banks's past problems with flying very close to some very corrupt people. And any indication that spills into his current and future behavior. You can, as a mayor, and this is not an endorsement of bad governance or corruption, but by any means, but you can get away with a lot as long as the public perceives you to be performing your job. But if the public does not see these results, the sort of nitty-gritty of what's going on in the back becomes a bigger and bigger issue.
Well, we are just about out of time. So before thanking all of you, let me just go around once, see if you have any final thoughts about, our new mayor and where we're going as a city, and maybe what you'd like to see. So, if we could quickly do one round of that before we say goodbye, that would be great. Nicole, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first near month of Adam's mayoralty, we've had a big tragedy every single weekend, and I think we should all hope that we have an uneventful weekend this weekend coming up. We had the robbery murder of Crystal Bayron Neves in the Burger King in Harlem in the first weekend of his mayoralty. We also had the fire that killed 17 people in the Bronx. Then, of course, we had the killing of Michelle Go under the subway a week later. Then this past weekend, we had the killing of officers Rivera and Moore. And this points up that the mayor is starting out in a very difficult environment. Harder to think of a worst first month for a new mayor. Even when Bloomberg took office, 9/11 had receded as an acute emergency. When Giuliani took office, crime was actually on the downswing. Violent crime had started to go down under David Dinkins. And so if he is not very, very disciplined every single day of what is the long-term goal that I want to accomplish, then he can easily just navigate this one crisis to the next, and lose the focus on what are the long-term goals.
Richard?
Yeah, Eric Adams ran the most striking campaign of any of the candidates out there. He was a vibrant personality. He gave people a sense of what he was about, and he used the narrative of his own personal story of someone who had been beaten in a police station house, who was on the verge of becoming the person in charge of the NYPD, someone who had grown up with a learning disability that went undiagnosed for too long, who was now about to be running the Department of Education. In terms of what skills he had to actually run city government, you were taking that largely on faith, where somebody like Catherine Garcia, because of her administrative abilities and her understanding of government as she had worked in it in the de Blasio administration and to some degree with Bloomberg, gave you the sense that she was more prepared to run a government. Adams more prepared to inspire people and to inspire the people of the city, to rally people, somewhat the way Koch did, although obviously with a different style. Now is the point at which you get away from the poetry on which you run and get into the prose of actual governing. And we'll have to see. I mean, I think that there are high hopes that he works out. The question is whether he's going to be able to live up to them and how he's going to be able to deal with adversity if it continues to come at him in the way that it has over these first 4 weeks.
This is just a precarious time for the city. Lots of issues. The pandemic is not over yet. How is the city going to look after the pandemic? Are people going to be going into work? Now municipal employees want to have a hybrid work schedule as well. So not just the private industry. How does that affect his tax base? I think, in these early weeks where we've had just this string of tragedies, as Nicole alluded to, Mayor Adams has just done a good job of just being present, showing up. He's been there, and my conversations with people, they feel that that's a very valuable in this moment of in time. But in the long run, he's going to have to develop some very serious, very specific plans on how to handle some of these issues. I know there's been some criticism of the safety plan that he introduced, that there's not enough details in there about how he's going to accomplish some of the goals. So I think going forward, even though this is a very rough start to anyone's mayoralty, he's done a good job of showing up, being public. But I think now people are going to want to see the plans. They're going to want to see, what is the mayor going to do about the fact that, we've had 8 or 9 pedestrians killed in this first month alone. How is the Department of Transportation going to change the streetscape, and how quickly can they do it? Those are the sort of things people want to see. The mayor has promised he can deliver on those things. it's at the beginning. So we'll give them some time and we'll see what happens. But this is New York City. We're very impatient.
Well, on that very true statement, I think we need to wrap things up. I just want to thank you all so much, Richard and Nicole and Jeff. I learned just so much today, and I'm sure the rest of the audience did. And maybe a year from now we reconvene and see how things have turned out. But thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, all of you in the audience who've joined us. Have a good day, and everyone stay safe. Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.